You might have noticed that there are pre-roll ads on my episodes now. If you hated them, remember you can always join our Patreon and get not just Crimes of the Centuries ad-free, but also Strange and Unexplained with Daisy Egan at the $8 tier at patreon.com/grabbagcollab. With that, you also get access to other shows like The Catalyst, Dear Daisy, Shut the F Up, Nick Lachey, and more. On to the show. Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label Crime of the Century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Frank Shorter, the man credited with single-handedly creating America's fascination with running, was being a great friend to his roommate, Dave Wodel. Wodel, the Olympic champion of the 800 meters, had just been married, and his new wife was in the Olympic Village to spend the night with her husband. Shorter, America's best hope for an Olympic marathon medal, decided to give them some privacy.
I was sleeping out on the balcony outside our room. I dragged a mattress out there and was sleeping, and I'd been sleeping out there for several days. And I remember waking up and hearing this door slam as if it were some kind of fire door or something, just banging shut. But in my daze, I thought, I've been here a couple weeks. It's the first time I've heard this sound. That's a gunshot.
It was September 5th, 1972. Shorter would spend the next 22 hours in his room directly across from Building 31 in Munich's Olympic Village to watch up close what the rest of the world was watching unfold via satellite.
I'm Jim McKay speaking to you live at this moment from ABC headquarters just outside the Olympic Village in Munich, West Germany. The peace of what have been called the Serene Olympics was shattered just before dawn this morning, about 5 o'clock, when Arab terrorists armed with submachine guns, faces blackened, a couple of them disguised as guards or as trash men in the Olympic Village, climbed the fence, went to the headquarters of the Israeli team, and immediately killed one man, Moshe Weinberg, a coach, 2 shots in the head, 1 in the stomach.
Israeli national wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg was a giant of a man. He had tried to stop the early morning terrorists from entering the compound where some of the Israeli athletes, mostly wrestlers, were housed for this tense but important Olympic Games. These were the 20th such games in the modern era, the first held in Germany since 1936, when Adolf Hitler had tried to make a point about Aryan supremacy, but, thanks to Jesse Owens, had utterly failed. Munich wanted to erase that memory despite an obvious flaw. It had been the birthplace of Nazism. And those 1936 games were the least of the Nazis' transgressions. The main stadium for the Munich Games was a mere 20 miles from Dachau, the German city which housed the infamous Nazi concentration camp of the same name, and where Jews were enslaved, tortured, and murdered by the thousands a scant 30 years earlier. These games, though, were seen as a chance to start the young West Germany Republic off on the right foot.
People in Germany were so looking forward to getting some recognition from the world, they hoped. They were really gratified, enthusiastic, and proud.
That's Charlotte Knobloch, president of the Jewish community of Munich in Upper Bavaria. Her daughter was one of the official hosts of the Games, which had begun well enough. The Israeli team proudly participated in the parade of 7,000 of the world's best athletes, hailing from 120 countries, while holding the Israeli flag aloft, being adored and cheered by the international crowd, many of whom were German. Knobloch again.
To see an Israeli flag over the Olympic Stadium in Munich after such a relatively short time really was a sensation. And everything was working.
Also during that ceremony, 5,000 Bavarian doves flew up and away from the center of the stadium, signifying the peace it is said all men pray for. It was going well in other ways, too. The Romanian gymnastics phenom Olga Korbut was nabbing perfect tens, and American Mark Spitz was dominating men's swimming, winning 7 gold medals and the adoration of every young American girl in the process. And, like I said, Frank Shorter had a real chance to medal in one of the game's last and most iconic events, the marathon. Then the fabric, carefully woven of good intentions, laced with pomp and peace and goodwill and brotherhood of man, ripped wide open to see that mankind can ruin with hate everything it builds. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Haya Health Products. My nephew Ollie eats everything under the sun. The kid is 11 and his favorite food is sushi. My kiddo, meanwhile, has about 5 things he'll willingly eat. I know he can't be getting all the nourishment he needs, which is why I love giving him Haya. Haya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full-body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And they do that while being made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy junk. Yet my kid still likes how they taste, which is nothing short of a miracle. Formulated with the help of nutritional experts for kids ages 2 and up, Haya is pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. And to make things easier, Haya is sent straight to your door so we parents have one less thing to worry about. We've worked out a special deal with Haya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hayahealth.com/COTC. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to HIYAHEALTH.com/COTC and get your kids the full-body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. The State of Israel was still young, having been created in 1948 after the British handed the management of Palestine to the United Nations, and David Ben-Gurion declared Israel an independent country, which was followed immediately by a lot of the rest of the world's blessing. That year had been full of Egyptian and Israeli dissent, which forced the closure of the Suez Canal and the continued stalemate over the drawing of international borders. The Black September Group was a breakaway military faction of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, known worldwide as the PLO. What that group did at the 1972 Olympics was just an example of the kind of ongoing guerrilla warfare that both sides managed to heap upon the other. That the PLO splinter group was trying to make a name for itself with a bold stroke on the world stage is certainly clear. Nowhere on earth would they find 4,000 working journalists at their disposal. Suffice to say, they accomplished worldwide recognition that September in Munich, something they had not achieved in the early months of 1972 when they murdered Jordanians who were accused of Israeli collaboration, or when they blew up oil tanks in Holland, or when they hijacked Sabina Air's Flight 371, demanding Israel release 200 of their countrymen from its prisons. That last effort failed when Israel, known for its mastery of its small but proficient special forces, did what special forces do and took down the terrorists. In that fracas, only one passenger died. Then there was that massacre of 20 or more, also in 1972, at Tel Aviv's Lod Airport, in which Palestinian-leaning Japanese killed mostly Puerto Rican tourist bystanders in a shootout. It was in this 1972 climate that the organizers of the 20th Olympiad, surely knowing better, made a gross miscalculation. They opted for being nice hosts over being prepared ones. Journalist Jim McKay in an ESPN documentary.
The Germans were determined to have a very soft and pleasant Olympics. In fact, the security guys wore pale blue blazers. And in the opening ceremony, it was wonderful. Children with flowers.
So desirous of wiping clean the image of military salutes in Hitler's brown shirt's presence at the last German-held games, they opted for less security rather than more, spending less than $2 million on the whole 2-week Olympic security detail that was uniformed in baby blue and whose only weapon was a walkie-talkie. One end result of that was a porous Olympic village where the athletes lived while competing. It was so porous that athletes nightly climbed over walls, unseen and unmolested, to get out and get back in. There were other mistakes. In 2012, the German newspaper Der Spiegel reported that the Munich authorities had been told in early 1972 the German ambassador in Lebanon had intelligence that an attack on the Israeli athletes was in the planning stages. They ignored him. And they ignored their own consultant, a forensic psychologist hired to enumerate the possible threats to the security of the games. George Sieber listed for them 26 serious concerns. Number 21 was the possibility of the Israeli team being taken hostage by Palestinians out to free their own political prisoners in an exchange. He even suggested that the world's athletes be housed by sport instead of country, so that the Israelis would not be concentrated in a single block of apartments. The organizers ignored that too. It was an appalling misreading of the situation that, coupled with criminally gross ineptitude, led to the worst day in Olympic history. A history that, admittedly, has had more than its share of bad days. It was probably the first day in which over 1 billion people watched the real-time progression of a terrorist attack, minute by horrible minute. That day, no one turned away from their television. The assault began at 4:33 that morning when 8 guerrillas, dressed in tracksuits and carrying gym bags, chatted amicably with some American athletes as they all scaled the unguarded gates of the village. Then the terrorists made their way to Compound 31 on Connolly Strasse, to where the Israeli athletes were headquartered. They opened their gym bags, took out their Kalashnikov assault rifles, and barged into the apartment where the Israelis slept. At least, they tried to. A training coach had heard the rustling at the door before the assault began and tried to brace himself against the door, shouting for his friends to take cover as the terrorists pushed from the other side. Chaos ensued, but the just awakened Israelis were overtaken. In the melee that immediately followed, wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg tried to fight back and was shot in the cheek. He survived that wound and continued to try to overcome his captors, only to be fatally shot within minutes. Those early efforts to contain those invading the space he shared with other athletes bought a few of them enough time to escape through a window. But Weinberg's death was followed in short order by the shooting of athlete Yosef Romano, who had responded as well with fight instead of submission. He was left in plain sight to bleed to death on the carpet in front of his friends. People were dead. There was no going back now. That left 9 live hostages. weightlifter Zia Friedman, wrestler Eliezer Halfin, track coach Amitzer Shapira, shooting coach Kihat Short, wrestler Mark Slane, fencing coach Andre Spitzer, weightlifting judge Jaco Springer, wrestling referee Josef Gutfrun, and wrestler David Berger, an American originally from Shaker Heights, Ohio, who had a law degree from Columbia University and fought hard to be on the Israeli wrestling team. Soon enough, the terrorists made their demands known. They would exchange their hostages for 234 of their comrades now being held in Israel. ABC, the network which had rights to broadcast the games, went live on the air with host Jim McKay doing, I hate to say it, a play-by-play of the action. The much-beloved and equally hated Howard Cosell was also tapped to cover the news crisis as it progressed that day. Still, the network was woefully unprepared for any such incident. Jennings, for example, reported via walkie-talkie, as did Cosell. But the day was just starting and calls were hastily made. Germany asked Israel what they wanted to do. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir had made it abundantly clear in the past that her country would not negotiate with terrorists. That, she had famously said, would mean that every Jew in the world was unsafe. She would not change her policy now. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Cremo. I can't think of many scents in this universe I'd love more than bourbon vanilla, so believe me when I say I'm loving the new Cremo body wash I got from my partner Scott. It smells amazing. Cremo's men's body wash makes a regular shower feel like a scent sensation. A sensation, if you will. Scott showered with Cremo just a few hours ago. In fact, he told me,
"By the way, I tried that bourbon vanilla body wash.
He loves this stuff. Cremo works with master perfumers to make sure every Cremo body wash scent is meticulously blended and refined, and their hard work definitely shows. Cremo has a distinct layered scent that actually evolves as you wash, getting you clean and making you smell great at the same time. Cremo also offers a range of other grooming products for men, including shave cream, beard oil, and shampoo. You can find Cremo men's body wash in its new distinctive bourbon vanilla scent at Walmart or Walmart.com. Once again, that's at Walmart or Walmart.com. The man handling negotiations for the Black September was Ludif Afif, who was as demanding as he was unhinged. As the crisis unfolded, he wore a white beach hat and linen safari suit. A dark substance was spread across his face. Was that charcoal or shoe polish? He went by the name Isa, Jesus in Arabic. In making the hostage for prisoner exchange demand, he initially set the deadline for 9 a.m. Thus began a carousel of Germans coming and going all day as the deadline slid first to 10 a.m., then noon, then 1 p.m., and so on, with Isa acknowledging the challenges that the Germans faced in communicating with Israel. The Germans were, at best, tap dancing to stall, as they were clear that Israel was not going to give an inch. Though they didn't tell the Black Septemberists this. You could call it diplomacy, I guess. It was more like a game in which there was no precedent and no rules. A lose-lose proposition. All the while, ABC's television audience grew worldwide to 1 billion, even as the crowds in Munich inside and outside the Olympic Village got bigger and more unwieldy. The crowds, according to reports, seemed oblivious to the danger that the hostages were in as they picnicked and lounged, asked for autographs of athletes they recognized, and waited for something to happen. as if this were a game. Behind the scenes, pandemonium. The games at first continued that morning, then they were suspended. Israeli leaders consulted and wrangled and stuck to their guns, trying to stay informed of the latest news while essentially helpless to fix this as it was on German land and had to be handled by German authorities. Germans, meanwhile, could not believe that they had to be the ones to save the Israelis. The world saw and felt the irony. Those authorities were consequently all over the place, trying to figure out how to wrest control of the hostages without appreciable violence. As the day wore on, schemes to rescue the hostages never seemed to gel. Two of the German negotiators, desperate to fix this fast so the world would not blame their country for yet more Jewish deaths, offered to trade places with the hostages. In return, Issa and other of the terrorists in Compound 31 offered to be exchange hostages themselves for the 234 they wanted released from Israeli captivity. Both ideas were non-starters. They tried offering to let the terrorists walk out of the compound and out of Germany, no strings attached, if they left the hostages behind and alive. Nope. They offered money, a lot of it. Also nope. Meanwhile, alongside the negotiations, the Germans were making plans to take the hostages by force. In the mid-afternoon, Walter Troger, an official affectionately known then as the mayor of the Olympic Village, was trying to buy time and gather some intel about who was in the apartment and how they were faring. He asked Issa if he could send in a contingent to check on the hostages. Issa agreed. The Germans came away appalled with what they had seen. Troger remembered.
It was a terrible sight, I must say. One of the victims lay under a cover. There was blood all over the walls, and the hostages were really desperate, I would say. I knew exactly that they were terrified, that they relied on us, on which decision or which, for whatever we would decide to do with them or with the terrorists. And that was not easy for me to know that and know that I couldn't do very much.
When asked by German law enforcement, the negotiators reported that they had seen 4 or 5 hostage takers holding the 9 hostages left alive. That number somehow became the operative number when those cooking up a new rescue plan were organizing their next effort. 5 terrorists, got it. Except there were 8. I see a problem. Anyway, as the day went on, 3 things crystallized. First, Israel was not changing its mind. Second, the Israelis had no authority to go in there and handle things themselves. And finally, the Germans could not let the terrorists get out of their country with the hostages in tow. The world would judge them very harshly if they could not protect these valued guests. In the late afternoon, a quickly assembled team of 38 volunteers were ordered to implement Operation Sunshine. Volunteer Heinz Hohensen.
The plan was to climb down the ventilation shaft, carrying machine guns, to get the terrorists and free the hostages. Suddenly, we realized that this could be like climbing into hell. We didn't have any information. We had no idea what was down there, where anybody was, how many people were dead. We knew nothing.
As the volunteers were questioning the wisdom of the plan, someone realized that the terrorists had TVs too. While the volunteer rescuers had been clinging to walls so as not to be seen, ABC had been live, documenting the rescuers getting into place for the quote-unquote surprise attack. This is a duh moment, like double, triple duh. I could have thought of this in 1972, and I wasn't even alive then. The rescue, naturally, was called off. Then German Chancellor Willy Brandt made a last resort kind of call. Let's ask Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat to broker a deal, he said. Sadat was no fool. He did not answer his phone. By now, 2 Israeli intelligence advisors had arrived in Germany to lend their assistance, something the Germans did not want. Gil Zamir, head of the Israeli Secret Service Mossad, advised keeping the talks going to wear down the terrorists. No one was listening. The Germans, already onto their next rescue effort, decided to offer the terrorists the option of going to a nearby airport and getting on a plane that would fly them with their hostages immediately into an Arab country, like Egypt, where the negotiations might be more successful. What they really wanted to do was force a showdown someplace less public and more open, where the terrorists would be more vulnerable to being overcome and captured. Okay, said Issa, knowing that it might be a trap, but he, too, was tired of them getting nowhere. By 6 p.m., the details were being worked out. The airport at Fürstenfeldbruck, a smaller facility than the main Munich airport, was chosen. Set near open woods and fenced in with an electrical wire, the site seemed to offer the would-be rescuers a lot of cover. But the logistics took time. By 9 p.m., the original set of roof-climbing shooters from earlier in the day had gone to the airport, tried to figure out a plan, and returned to explain what they now knew. And because there were a lot of captains in that room and not enough crew, someone had the thought to attack the terrorists while they were leaving the Olympic Village and wrap this baby up quickly. This idea got as far as Issa, who agreed to the airport idea, but wanted to see the path the terrorists would have to take to get to the helicopters. He followed the Germans into the garage and saw the trap for what it was and declined this idea. "Bring me buses to take us to the airport," he said. That was acceptable to the Germans, but only if he promised not to harm the pilots or take them hostage. "No problem," said Issa. "Your pilots are safe." All settled. By now, a fully fueled Lufthansa jet waited on the Fürstenfeldbruck runway, its crew removed to be replaced by the German squad who were set to attack the 5 terrorists when they got aboard. The squad had quickly been dressed in Lufthansa gear. At 10:15, the little crowd of handcuffed athletes and members of Black September got into 2 helicopters and left public view. Peter Jennings reported,
"One of the helicopters now proceeds out over the Olympic site, out over the main stadium where half the lights are on. The second helicopter is now following it and moving out around this tremendously high major Olympic tower as they depart to a destination we, of course, as yet do not know."
You know, the movies are full of daring-do heroes who pull off stunning rescues of doomed people every day. I know, in real life, that doesn't always work out, but I also know that in this country, we spend a lot of American dollars to train brave people to do special stuff with special equipment and special circumstances to do all kinds of fancy shit to save endangered Americans. But this little band of Germans who were assigned to go to Fürstenfeldbruck weren't them. They were not trained snipers, for one. For another, they were not given night vision glasses, telescopic sights, bulletproof gear, or helmets. They didn't even have walkie-talkies to communicate with one another, despite the fact that every unarmed cop at the Olympic Village and throughout every Olympic venue had them. Without them, the chances they would shoot one another drastically increased. Further, they didn't have much experience, which was dumb. They had all day to find the finest snipers and the most rigorously trained assault specialists in the country to do the job, which someone, somewhere, surely had been thinking of since the ordeal began. It was going to be dark out there. It was going to be chaotic. The last thing you need is amateurs thinking they're Rambo. Undeterred, some of the German rescue force began selecting their shooting positions behind buildings, on roofs, from inside a garage, from on top of the airport fire station. 16 officers duly got onto the Lufthansa jet and quickly reviewed with real crew what to do and how to fool the terrorists into believing they were harmless stewards who maybe knew which lever to pull to release in case of a water landing. Then they looked around and realized they were about to go shooting up an airplane sitting on thousands of gallons of jet fuel. When the 16 men had been given Lufthansa uniforms, there had not been enough pants to go around, so some men kept their police pants on. It was not the most convincing of ruses. They knew that, and, while waiting, they let their suspicions speak.
On board the plane, we had some discussions, but we agreed not to go through with it because we decided it would be a suicide mission. We didn't have the proper uniforms, and the terrorists were not stupid. They would have seen that we were not real stewards.
The terrorists in the helicopters had the same desperate thoughts of failure as they were flying to the airport. Jamal al-Ghashi told author Simon Reeves, quote, "We began to get the feeling that a trap was waiting for us, so we began to prepare ourselves," end quote. Searchlights shone on the jet, with others waiting to light up the helicopters when they landed. This would put the rescuers at an advantage, allowing them to see what they were shooting at while the terrorists could not. The helicopter trip from the village took longer than it should have. That heightened terrorist suspicion that something was up. When the helicopters finally landed, Isa and fellow terrorists got out to inspect the waiting jet. The volunteer pilots also got out and began to move toward safety. Isa stopped them to have a brief discussion, which forced them to return to the choppers. He had, if you remember, promised that the 4 pilots would not be harmed or held hostage. He was now less inclined to uphold his end of the bargain. At some time before the 2 guerrillas stepped into the prepared jet, the 16 Germans set to kill them had decided to step off. Communication was so bad that not a single German in charge or a single German on the ground as backup knew they had done so. Later, when the untangling of what happened was reviewed, some would say that the men on the plane were not that important, that the snipers on the ground were to do most of the work, killing the 3 remaining terrorists on the ground. It would make no difference really, but what happened next can only be described as a catastrophic failure, a debacle, a mess of epic proportions. Isa took one look at the empty plane and knew he had been set up. He was yelling as he ran back to the choppers. This is where that earlier mistake, the miscounting of how many terrorists there had been in the first place, would prove fatal. Early in the intel gathering, when a contingent was allowed to check on the hostages, they had reported seeing 4 or 5 hostage takers. That was the number upon which they were still operating now, some 20 hours after the ordeal began. The snipers gathered, took count. 3 men stood outside of one craft. 1 stood outside the other. 2 men were running. That made 5. The order was given to fire on them. The 2 men holding the volunteer pilots were hit first. 1 died instantly, the other was wounded. But 7 men, armed with what we now call AK-47s, threw everything they had in the direction the fire was coming from. The searchlights went out and the darkness provided cover all around. The farcical rescue fell apart. The strict instructions not to shoot at the fueled jet or helicopters full of hostages were ignored. Later, Again, the Germans would say that they assumed the hostages had run for safety, but they had not. They remained shackled to their seats, helpless to wait out the hour-long siege. It was very late in the game when German special assault units arrived at the airport to help. Mostly they were sent in to protect the officials who had been on site watching this spectacle unfold. When armored tanks drove across the tarmac, a panicked and defiant terrorist shot every hostage in one chopper. Isa then pulled the pin from a grenade and threw it into the other, killing the rest. The Israeli intelligence officers could only watch and grieve, appalled. The world had been sitting in the dark for hours. Outside the Fürstenfeldbruck airport, journalists waited, crowds of the interested waited. In fact, traffic had been backed up all over Munich as people tried to find out where the big finale was taking place. And some unidentified guy got in front of the crowd at the airport gates and announced that, quote, "Everything is fine. All hostages have been released," end quote. The news was as good as anyone had ever hoped. Reporters fled the scene to get to phones to tell their editors to run with it. The Olympic Village went wild with celebration. The German Chancellor's spokesman spoke with pride about the success of the effort and that the Games will go on, and soon, he guessed, no one would remember this. In Israel, there were celebratory toasts and reveling at the highest levels of government. The truth was that the helicopter crews were alive. 5 of the 8 terrorists were dead. 3 were in captivity. 1 German was killed and a few wounded, likely by friendly fire. And every Israeli hostage had been shot or burned to death. It would be up to Jim McKay of ABC Sports to correct the narrative.
Our worst fears have been realized tonight. They've now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone.
President Richard Nixon called David Berger's family in Cleveland and asked what he could do. They said they wanted to bring their son safely home. Nixon sent an Air Force jet to get him. It was decided that the Games would go on. Not everyone agreed with that decision. The Dutch team, among a few others, went home as soon as possible. Mark Spitz, the American swimmer and of Jewish heritage, had already flown to safety in London, sheltered on the trip by 3 German bodyguards. If nothing else, the U.S. and the rest of the Western world had been taught something about terrorism, awakened at last to what the rest of the world had been dealing with. A memorial service for the dead athletes was held the next day. Olympic flags flew at half-mast. The Israeli government asked the United States and West Germany to quit the Games, but they did not order their athletes to comply. The American basketball team went on to play the most controversial game ever in the Olympics in the gold medal round, replaying the last minutes 3 times before the Soviet team claimed they won. The Americans refused to accept the silver medal in protest. Frank Shorter, who had been stunned by all he had seen and not seen that one September day, decided he had to run.
And then the anger, I think, very quickly gave way to resolve. And the resolve was, of course we have to go on. Of course the Games have to continue. Because these people wanted us to stop. Therefore, we won't. We can't.
He took gold with a time of 2 hours, 12 minutes, 19 seconds. The traditional thunderous applause for the entrance of the marathon winner into the Olympic Stadium was marred for Shorter when a German imposter ran into the stadium ahead of him, looking fresh as a daisy and gathering most of the audience's exuberant praise. Shorter took it in stride. It was not the worst thing to happen that week. Not by a very, very long shot. The world waited to see what would happen to the 3 surviving terrorists now in German jails. Israeli Prime Minister Meir, cautious, counseled against revenge. But on October 29, 1972, 7 weeks after the first in Feldbruck debacle, a Lufthansa plane was hijacked by Black September terrorists who vowed to blow it up if the 3 men in German custody weren't released. The Germans, figuring this was not their war, quietly released the trio of hostage takers. And Meir, just as quietly, decided to change her mind on that revenge thing. She told her special forces to hunt them down and kill them. That mission was to be named, fittingly, Operation Wrath of God. Meir did not just want the 3 remaining Black September members who Germany had let go. She wanted everybody who had planned the attack on the athletes and everybody in that organization who could have possibly taken any part. She therefore signed death warrants for 35 known members of the PLO, and she let loose 15 highly trained assassins separated into 5 squads around the world to do their worst. And the more successful they became, the more the PLO and others took it personally and embarked on their own campaign of revenge. And so it goes. Today, only one of the men who took the hostages is alive. Jamal al-Gashey is believed to be in hiding, still, in North Africa. He's 71. He does give interviews, most notably for the book and the documentary about the 1972 events, both titled One Day in September. The film won an Academy Award in 1999. The survivors of the victims spent 20 years trying to find out what really happened on the tarmac that night. But the Germans, known to make the trains run on time and known to keep notes, they recorded everything they had done in World War II, seemed to have forgotten how to find documents pertaining to this debacle. Author Simon Reeve reported that 4 years after the airport shootout, the families banded together to ask for documentation and compensation. No response. 6 months later, they asked again, and they got a, yeah, maybe, but nothing else. And for a full 2 decades, the survivors, mostly Ankie Spitzer, the wife of slain fencing master Andre Spitzer, hounded the Germans for some kind of explanation, something that explained to them exactly how that night airport raid had gone so horribly wrong. They also blamed the Israeli government, which apparently had made no preparations for the athletes' safety either. In 1992, Widow Spitzer appeared on German TV, and someone who knew something reached out anonymously to give her the documents she had been waiting for. All the mistakes the Germans made were there. All the botched ideas, the lack of planning, the fumbling disorganization, all of it. They had not protected the Jews. Some in the world saw that as no surprise. In 2012, on the 40th anniversary of the massacre, NBC sportscaster Bob Costas defied the International Olympic Committee and held his own moment of silence when the Israeli team walked during the opening ceremonies of the Games in London. Costas felt it unconscionable that the 11 dead would not be remembered. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read Simon Reeve's definitive retelling of that day in his book, One Day in September. She watched the Oscar-winning documentary of the same name, reviewed quite a few of the sports specials produced by ABC and ESPN. Especially good was the Emmy Award-winning program 1972 Olympic Special, Tragedy of the Munich Games. She visited the Israel Forever website that has a page dedicated to the massacre. She also took in Steven Spielberg's 2005 film, Munich. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.